I'm really grateful for the opportunity to meet with the young men and women in Copenhagen to talk about an issue which is the hottest today, isn't it? Now, the 7th of October wasn't a usual event, a most unusual event. It has shaken the world, and the world is still shaking. But actually, the problem that led to the 7th of October did not start on the 6th of October or on the 5th of October. This problem started more than a century ago. And if you listen to the media, if you watch television, if you read articles here and there, you tend to come across commentary or analysis that gives you the impression that the problem started only a few days ago. As if the Jews and the Muslims were living together peacefully and suddenly they got mad and started killing each other. Far from it. And I'd like to use the time given to me to explain to you two things. First, the relationship between the Muslims and the Jews, what it was and what has become of it, and then how this conflict started in the first place and how it developed over the years. Now, for about 14 centuries, the Jews lived in much of the Muslim world without any problem. No problem whatsoever. They lived in Iraq, the most ancient Jewish community on the face of the earth, going all the way back to the times of Babel, because they were the ones who were captured from the Holy Land and brought to Iraq in the first captivity and in the second captivity. And their remnants remain in Iraq until about 1952 or 53. Imagine, nearly 14 centuries. They were in Egypt, they were in Syria, they were in Lebanon, they were in North Africa, they were in Morocco, they were in Iran, they were in Yemen, everywhere except for Palestine. The Jews who came to Palestine came as visitors most of the time. They didn't stay because they believed it was haram for them to stay in Palestine. So the doctrine that prevailed among the Jews for so many centuries was that it was haram for them to settle inside Palestine. How come then suddenly they remembered this was the promised land 3,000 years ago and that they needed to go back to it? It doesn't make sense. I mean, if you live for 14 centuries under Islam so comfortably and so happily, to the extent that when Islam ended in Spain and the Muslims were kicked out, the Jews followed them because the Christians started persecuting the Muslims and the Jews. And the Jews knew from experience that the only place where they could have a safe haven was in Muslim lands. Okay, enough for this. Let's come back, fast forward to the middle of the 19th century. The middle of the 19th century in Europe witnessed an increasing number of attacks on Jews. In Russia, where they were known as the Russian pogroms. You can read about them. By the way, the information I tell you now is all documented. You just go to the library. I will be mentioning a few references for you to take note if you want to do further reading. The Russian pogroms were followed by other incidents elsewhere in Europe, like the famous or infamous Dreyfus affair in France, culminating several decades later with the Holocaust in Germany, or in Germany and Eastern Europe. The Christians of Europe always had a problem with the Jews. Unlike the Muslims didn't have a problem with the Jews because Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala settled things for them. We were told that those who believe in Christianity and those who believe in Judaism are people of the book, Ahlul Dhimma. They have a covenant from Allah and His Rasul, and they are to be respected and protected. And so long as they do not initiate aggression, they have to be provided with a peaceful milieu, with a safe haven. And this continued to be the case throughout history. Europe, unlike Christianity in Europe, unlike the Muslims, always had a problem with the Jews. First, they accused the Jews of killing Jesus Christ. Then they developed over the years what became known as the global Jewish conspiracy, that anything that goes wrong in the world, the Jews are responsible for it. For instance, if there is an epidemic somewhere, the Jews are behind it. If there is famine, the Jews are behind it. If there is a war, the Jews are behind it. Everything the Jews are accused of doing. And this is embedded in the document known as the Protocols of the Elders of Zion. Have you heard of the document before? Any of you? There's a document called the Elders, the Elders of Zion, the Protocols of the Elders of Zion. In Arabic, Protocolat Hukama Suhyun, which were translated from the original Russian into French, into English, and then into Arabic, unfortunately. And the Arabic translation was taken up as if it was a fact. Many Arabs and Muslims were affected by it and started believing exactly like the Christians of Europe used to believe, that the Jews are a community that only produces evil. Actually, in Al-Quran, we are told about the people of the book, and the Jews in particular, لَيْسُوا سَوَاء. They are not the same. There are good people, there are bad people. Just like the Muslims, there are good people, there are bad people. In every community, in every religious community, in every ethnic community. This is the nature of humanity. This document was authored by a person or a community close to the Tsar in Russia, because they were seeing the turmoil happening, and they wanted to preempt the revolution that brought down the Tsar in Russia. The royal family hold on Russia, and they pretended to be elders of the Jewish community who were telling the world that they were evil. I mean, imagine like people coming together from one certain community, and they write a document saying, oh, we are the most evil people on the face of the earth, and we are going to cause havoc everywhere. We are going to cause bloodshed. We are going to cause corruption. I mean, can you imagine this happening anywhere? Not only that, the source of the document is unknown. The translator of the document into English says in his introduction that the document was snatched by a woman in Paris from a man who was passing through and spending the night in a hotel or in a hostess. And apparently that man took the document from someone who is related to the elders of the Jewish community without even mentioning a place or a location. This document was used by Hitler to justify the Holocaust. Oh, look at the Jews. Look how bad the Jews are. We have to get rid of them, because if we don't get rid of them, so and so and so will happen to us. Alhamdulillah, in Islam, we don't have this problem. As I told you, until about 7 years, or probably 5 years after the creation of the State of Israel in 1948, most Jewish communities in the Arab region were still living there happily and comfortably. Who got them out of those places that were homeland for every one of them? It was actually the Zionist movement. Recently, Professor Avi Shlaim published his autobiography under the title 3 Worlds, Memoirs of an Arab Jew, and in which he tells the story of his family, how his family was removed from their home in Baghdad and sent to Israel to become Israeli citizens after the creation of Israel, because Israel was in dire need of a population. Same thing happened in Egypt, same thing happened all over the region. Now, who is then behind the creation of Israel? Where does it come from? Where does the idea come from? Remember, I told you about the persecution of the Jews in Russia and elsewhere in Europe? The Jews who were talented, educated, and couldn't find a decent job were usually of the habit of converting to Christianity, baptizing. They go become Christian and then they can find a job. Because as a Jew, there was always discrimination against them in Europe. One of the most famous examples was who? The father of Karl Marx. You know the name Karl Marx? The founder of communism. His father was born as a Jew but converted to Christianity to find a job. Karl Marx, since his childhood, didn't believe in anything. So he grew up as an atheist and even despised all religion, including Judaism. Some people are silly to believe that Marxism was created by the Jews. Actually, the founder of Marxism didn't believe in Judaism. He even hated it. One such man was Theodor Herzl. You heard the name Theodor Herzl before? Theodor Herzl, the founder, he is said to be the founder of Zionism. Zionism is the movement, and the founder of that movement is Theodor Herzl. Theodor Herzl was an Austrian journalist, and he had difficulties in his life that he decided to become a Christian. As he was thinking about it, the news of the Russian pogrom came from Russia. So he decided the solution must be something else. He discussed it with some of his friends. Why don't we Jews have a country of our own? Why can't we be like the French, like the English, like the German, like the Austrian, have a Jewish state of our own? A new idea, but a very difficult one. And the most difficult thing about it is that religious Jews were opposed to it. Most of the Jews of the world continued to oppose Zionism and believe Zionists to be kuffar, to be heretic, until nearly about the week before First World War erupted, until nearly about the year 1939. Why? Because the Jews in their doctrine believe that it is haram for them to settle in Palestine until the Messiah comes. They have to wait for the Messiah. The Messiah will take them back, and when he takes them back, they will re-establish the kingdom of the Lord on the face of the earth. And there are still Jews who believe in this. Orthodox Jews believe in this. When Theodor Herzl wanted to convene his conference, the first Zionist Congress, he chose Zurich as a location in Switzerland. Zurich was a live city, a big city with a big Jewish community. So he thought it would be a good idea to have it there. It was the Jews of the city who kicked him out and prevented him from holding the conference. And he had to go to Basel, a much smaller town, a border town, with a much smaller Jewish community. And when he convened his conference, the elders of the Jewish communities in Northern America convened a conference in Montreal in Canada, declaring Theodor Herzl and the Zionists to be non-Jewish, murtad, they said, apostates, out of the deen, out of the religion. Because they said they were forcing the hand of God. You cannot, in Jewish doctrine, force the hand of God by doing something that God doesn't want it to happen yet. And there's a very good book I would recommend to you. It's called Jewish Fundamentalism in Israel by Israel Shahak, an Israeli historian, who actually mentions in his book that in the Talmud there are 3 covenants that God took from the Jews, from the Israelites. First, not to migrate en masse to Palestine as a big group, as a community. Second, not to pray for the coming of the Messiah before his time, because he has a time and the time is decided by God, and we are not to intervene in the timing that God had chosen. And third, to avoid entering into wars with the Goyim or the Gentiles, the others who are not Jewish, because whenever you enter into a war with them, you endanger the very existence of the Jewish religion. To preserve the Jewish religion, you need to be peaceful and lay low and accept the authority of others. Now, what changed the world and made Zionism succeed? In the initial days, Zionism found it very, very difficult. Theodor Herzl, from day number 1, knew that the creation of a Jewish state in Palestine was going to be difficult. So he suggested to the people who attended the conference in Basel, why don't we have it elsewhere? Why Palestine? Because remember, Theodor Herzl didn't believe in the Torah. He didn't believe in the sacredness of the Holy Land. He didn't believe in Moses. He once wanted to prove to his followers that he was not religious, so he brought a ham sandwich and started eating ham. And you know, ham to the Jews is even more haram than ham to the Muslims, if not the same. But he wasn't a believer. He didn't believe. So he said, why don't we go to Argentina? Argentina is a much better place, far away from the Muslims, no headache, and plenty of cows, plenty of good things, minerals, whatever. The deputies who came to the conference from Russia said to him, but how are you going to convince the Jews that Argentina is sacred? No, it won't work. It has to be Palestine. But that's not why they succeeded in establishing a state in Palestine. They succeeded for the following reasons. First reason, the result of the First World War. And by the way, these events, I want to, as I list these events to you, I want you to think how these developments happen in the history of humanity. It is not that someone is sitting somewhere in a lofty place planning and deciding how the world should work. It's impossible. No human being or no human community is capable of something like this, because planning the world is Allah's business. But actually what happens is, as Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala tells us in Al-Quran, وَلَوْلَا دَفْعُ اللَّهِ النَّاسَ بَعْضَهُمْ بِبَعْضٍ لَفَسَدَتِ الْأَرْضِ. Had it not been for this interplay, continuous interplay that Allah made as part of the nature of this world, Allah pushing people and pulling them against each other, life on earth would have gone rotten, would have been corrupt. This is the interplay, the tadafa', the continuous interaction. The First World War happened. The Ottomans allied themselves with the Germans. They end up losing the war and losing much of the territory that was under their rule. What happened to that territory? It's shared among the Russians, the French, and the British. The Middle East in particular was between the French and the British. The British in particular had an interest in paving the way for the creation of a Jewish state in Palestine. Why? Why did the British want to do this? The first reason is racist. The British didn't want the Jews who were being persecuted in Eastern Europe to come to Western Europe. And they were aided in this by other Western European countries. We don't want the Jews. Look, today they pretend to love the Jews and they rush to Jerusalem and to Tel Aviv to meet Netanyahu and to express support, and you can do whatever you want to the Palestinians. They are all hypocrites. They're all hypocrites. Deep down, many of them are anti-Semites. Just like Balfour. Arthur Balfour, the one who made the Balfour Declaration, promising the Jews Palestine as a homeland, was accused by the Jewish community in 1905 when he was Prime Minister of Britain of being anti-Semitic because of the white paper he issued in which he bans Jewish migration from Eastern Europe to Britain. They said to him, you hate the Jews, that's why you are doing it. So racism is one reason. A second reason is that Britain at the time and some other parts of Europe were governed by a group of people who belonged to Christian Zionism. Have you heard this term before, Christian Zionism? Christian Zionism is much older than Jewish Zionism. Christian Zionism started with Martin Luther, the founding father of the Protestant sect. He and Calvin came up with this idea that the role of the Jews in the kingdom of the Lord is to pave the way for the coming of the Messiah. Who's Messiah this time? The Christian Messiah, not the Jewish Messiah. They're two different things. Everybody has a Messiah. The Christians believed that in order for their own Messiah to come, all the Jews must be sent back to Palestine. And that's why, as Grace Halsell said in several of her books, and she was a great writer, one of the best writers on Christian Zionism, she has a booklet I would strongly recommend. It's called Forcing the Hand of God. Her name is Grace Halsell, American journalist. She passed away. And I had a very close friendship with her, visiting her in New York. She visited me in London. A great writer. She said that 60% of those who go to church regularly in America, to evangelical churches, to Protestant churches, are Christian Zionists. And that's why the biggest lobby supporting Israel in America is not the Jewish lobby. It's the Christian Zionist lobby. People like Pompeo, you heard what he said the other day if you're following the news? He said, it is part of my religious belief that this land belongs to the Jews and that the Jews must be enabled to have their state there and to live peacefully, etc. And that's because he's a Christian Zionist. That's their belief. Yet, we come to the more important reason. And the more important reason is that the victors in the First World War wanted to make sure that having destroyed the last form of Islamic state, the last form of Islamic caliphate, that the Muslims would never be allowed to stand on their feet again. How do you do this? You do it by two things. First, plant something alien right in the middle, acting like a dagger inserted in the heart that keeps the body paralyzed, keeps the body bleeding, unable to do anything sensible, unable to develop, unable to progress. And that's the Zionist entity that was created in Palestine, right in the center of the Muslim lands, right in the heart of the Muslim lands. The other thing you do is surrounded by artificial states, failing states, the governments of which do not represent their people, and use persecution and suppression in order to maintain their hegemony. And look at the Arab world. What sort of states surround Palestine today? What sort of states that don't have the power to open the gates of Rafah, to allow medicines in, to allow the wounded out, to give people an opportunity to breathe? Who is ruling Egypt today? Who is ruling Jordan today? Who is ruling the rest of the Arab world? Who is ruling Saudi Arabia today? Turning Saudi cities into discos, the Holy Land. Who is ruling the Arab world? Zionists. They speak the Arab language and they pretend to be Muslim, but in heart they are Zionists. Zionism is not just Jewish. There are some Jews who are Zionists. There are many Jews who are not, and they are opposed to Zionism. There are some Christians who are Zionists, many of them, especially in North America. And there are an increasing number of Arab and Muslim Zionists who collaborate with the Zionists who occupy Palestine in order to kill the dream of returning this place, which is so dear to every one of us, to the Ummah. So this was an opportunity for them. The result of the First World War was a great opportunity for them. So the Zionist project in Palestine has nothing really to do with the Jews that lived in the Arab region or in the Muslim world. It had to do with some of the Jews who were in Eastern Europe. It is an Eastern European phenomenon in its origin. And I invite you to read about this because I don't want you to grow up like I grew up. I grew up as a young man in the Islamic movement, reading literature about the conflict written by people who were not experts and who were using the fake document, the protocols of the elders of Zion, to explain what this conflict is about. And they turned it into a conflict between the Muslims and the Jews. And they had to invent this idea that we've been a conflict with the Jews for 14 centuries. Far from it. It's not true at all. Go back to the books of history and read. And you will find that, especially during the golden years of the Islamic Caliphate, when the Muslims in Baghdad were the shining light on humanity, on the human civilization, many of the scholars, of the translators in particular, who translated the ancient books of philosophy, of medicine, of astronomy, of maths, were actually Christian and Jewish, because they knew the languages of these people. And they were members of the Muslim community, but kept their deen, because Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala told us, La ikraha fi din. We cannot compel anybody to change their deen into Islam. That has to be out of their free will. So they lived there, and they lived there for 14 centuries with no problem whatsoever. And that's why the founding fathers of Israel, or of Zionism, were actually all secular atheists. I have a friend, Rabbi Wise, from the Naturi Carta group. I usually go with him on lecture tours, and recently we did a lecture tour of 15 cities in the UK. He has a big picture, he shows his audience usually, of those who launched the State of Israel in 1948. And he'd ask the audience, why is there no rabbi with them? Not a single person covering his head. You know, to the Jews, covering the head is a must if you are religious, because none of them believed in Judaism. And there's a brilliant book about this I recommend to you if you can get hold of it. It's called The Myths of Zionism. The Myths of Zionism, by someone called John Rose. John, you know how to write John, and then Rose, the flower. This man was a Zionist and then realized Zionism was wrong and became a supporter of Palestine. And he wrote this book in which he proves that the founding fathers of Zionism and the State of Israel were all atheists. They didn't believe in the Torah, they didn't believe in Allah. And despite that, they used the Torah to justify their projects. You know, this is an evil project. This is not an easy one. You have to come, kick the people from their land, kick them out, massacre them if need be, as they're doing now in Gaza. You take the land and you claim God gave it to you. I mean, imagine this happening here. I mean, imagine that when the Palestinians came from Lebanon to Denmark or to some of the other Scandinavian countries, they came to the Danish people here and said, hey, by the way, this is not your land. This is the land of our ancestors. God told us this. Don't argue with me. My God told me this is my land. So you have to get out and I have to take it. Once I was watching an interview on BBC Two, BBC television. An interview the correspondent was conducting with a lady from a settlement near my hometown, Al-Khalil, in the West Bank, Hebron. He asked her a very simple question. He said to her, tell me, how do you justify coming from Europe, taking the land of these people and leaving them like this in shack houses? And she said to him the following, if God did not tell me to do it, I would be a criminal. Imagine, what sort of religion is this? That you believe that God tells you to steal other people's properties? That God tells you to go and kill them? What sort of God is this? This is the ideology they created. Actually, religious Jews don't accept this. Like my friend Rabbi Wise or my friend Rabbi Beck, with whom I had a joint lecture a few weeks ago, and inshallah in the coming few days we are going to air it on Al-Hiwar TV. They don't believe in this. They say whatever these Zionists are saying is against Judaism. They say we pray for the end of the Zionist state in Palestine peacefully, and peaceful end. They want a peaceful end. And he says, this Rabbi Beck, he was born in Jerusalem originally, but he and his family left because they didn't want to live under the rule of a Zionist state. He said, I'd only go back to Palestine when Palestine is ruled by the Muslims. And this reminds me of a brilliant piece by Muhammad Asad. It's called Jerusalem, the Open City. It's one, Muhammad Asad left behind a few books. One of them is a collection of articles. One of the articles, Jerusalem, the Open City, he shows that throughout history, Jerusalem remained open to all believers, irrespective of their background, only when it was ruled by the Muslims. Why? Because in our deen, we don't compel people to change their deen. It's not acceptable. It's not acceptable. So, Zionism is a real problem. And it started as an atheist, secular movement. However, something did change over time. What did change? The secularists who were ruling Israel and then expanded in 1967 when they occupied the West Bank, the Golan Heights, Sinai, they needed to fill the newly conquered lands with residents. You cannot have a state without people, without a population. You need a population. So how do they convince Jews living elsewhere, Jews who are in Brooklyn, Manhattan, in South Africa, and Europe, to leave and come? Gradually, they mixed up aspects of the religion, of the Jewish religion, with Zionism. And this is what produced the current trend known as religious Zionism. Actually, it's a contradiction in terms, because Zionism is supposed to be secular, but now we have a trend which is led by the likes of Smotrich and Ben Gvir, these guys who have now become part of the coalition that is ruling in the Zionist state together with Netanyahu, and who want to cleanse the land of all the Arabs and all the Muslims. They actually took aspects of the Torah, remodeled them, mixed them with Zionism, and became known as the movement of Zionists, of religious Zionists. Now remember, I told you when I started that many people thought that this problem started on the 6th of October. You can see now, I hope, that it started more than a century ago. But the real creation of the State of Israel took place in 1948. How did it happen? And why did they succeed in expelling 750,000 Palestinians who were 2/3 of the Palestinian population at the time? Because of the massacres they perpetrated. They perpetrated massacres, frightening everybody else out. My mother, for instance, my mother was 16 years old when Deir Yassin happened. My mother was born and grew up in a city right in the south called Bir Saba, Beersheba. The news arrived that the Zionists were butchering people left and right. No distinction. And the Zionists wanted the news to reach as far as possible so that people are intimidated and frightened and decide to leave. The other thing that helped them was the surrounding of Palestine. Most of the Arab countries at the time were either a French colony or a British colony. What do you expect from their armies? To fight? To prevent the loss of Palestine? Of course not. They actually helped pave the way for the Zionists because they told Palestinians, okay, you can leave. It's just a couple of days, maximum 2 weeks. My mother told me, her father was told, probably 2 weeks' time you'll be back. Just lock the key, lock the door, take the key with you, and we will do the job. We will prevent the Zionists from taking over. They never went back. They could never go back. So there were a number of factors that enabled the creation of this entity. Arabs were always on the receiving end, always get beaten. On the 7th of October, there was a reversal. For the first time, probably the second time with a few exceptions, because it happened on the 6th of October, 1973, when the Egyptian army crossed into Sinai, took the Israelis by surprise, and caused havoc and instilled horror in their hearts. Had it not been for the fact that Sadat actually didn't mean it, he wasn't serious about it. I'm sure his soldiers were serious and they were willing to continue the fight until all of the land was free. But Sadat only wanted to move things around because this is the agreement he had with Henry Kissinger at the time in order to pave the way for a peace treaty, which happened later on. But the 7th of October was something completely different. It has reminded the world that so long as there is occupation, so long as there is injustice in the land, there can never be peace. And of course, I want to conclude with a few tips for you as you discuss this issue with others. You are likely to discuss it with a friend in school, in college. You are likely to discuss it with a neighbor, with a colleague at work. You are likely to be invited by the media to talk about it. It happens occasionally. What language to use and how to describe it. Very simple, just tell the truth. We don't need to invent anything. If the truth is on your side, the truth is your weapon. The Zionists, on the other hand, need to lie, and they need to lie constantly, continuously, non-stop. You saw the sort of lies that even a stupid guy like Biden fell for them and repeated the lies, and then he was reminded by the White House later on that it wasn't true, the beheading of babies by Hamas. Those who are unjust, those who are the aggressors, of course they use fabrications and lies to justify themselves. But what is the story for us? It's very simple. You don't have to say, I support this group or that group. That's not the issue. The issue here is not Hamas. The issue here is the occupation, is the apartheid regime, the regime that is so racist that since the apartheid of South Africa, the world hasn't seen anything as evil as this regime that is controlling Palestine today. So you need to equip yourself with the facts, arm yourself with the facts of history and the facts of what's going on. Avoid rumors. Beware of what you take from the social media, because social media is very useful, definitely, because it has broken the monopoly in the mainstream media. But there is a lot of stuff in the social media that you cannot authenticate, you cannot rely on. You need to make sure what you use is authentic, is true. So we have to find out about the source, who the source is. Finally, very finally, to give you some time for interaction, what is likely to happen now? People are asking this question, what's likely to happen? Although this time, of course, it's a lot more painful for the people of Gaza. You see the destruction, the genocide that is being exacted on them. But actually, it happened before at smaller scales. It happened in 2008, 2009, 2012, 2014, 2021. Every time, the Israelis thought they could crush the people's will and end the resistance, and they couldn't do it. So the first scenario is that despite all the destruction, they will fail. Inshallah, we pray for the failure. The second scenario is for this to drag on and get out of hand and expand wider. More countries become involved, although nobody wants to get involved. Arab governments in particular are very, very concerned at the moment. Some of them secretly say to Netanyahu, come on guy, finish them off and let us have a peace of mind. Because they're worried. There's turmoil under the surface in every one of these countries. That's a likelihood. I don't see signs of it yet, but it's possible. The third scenario is for a second Nakba, as the Israelis call it, to happen. But actually it won't be the second Nakba. It will be probably the fourth or the fifth Nakba. We haven't had just one Nakba in 1948. We had a Nakba in 1967. We had the greatest Nakba, in my opinion, is 1993. What did happen in 1993, remember? Oslo. The PLO, which was supposed to liberate Palestine, entered into a deal with Israel, recognizing it in exchange for nothing. In exchange of being recognized as a sole representative of the Palestinian people. I didn't ask them to represent me. My mother didn't ask them to represent her. They don't represent us. That was the biggest act of treason in our history. Now, suppose a second Nakba happens, a third Nakba happens, a fourth Nakba happens. So what? Has the cause died ever? Have the people ever forgotten about it? Never. The children, the young men who are resisting today in Gaza are the grandchildren, if not the grandchildren of the people who were dispossessed in 1948 and thrown out of their towns into the refugee camps in Gaza, in the West Bank, in Syria, in Lebanon, and in Jordan. And it's not going to be over because this is not a Palestinian issue. Yes, we Palestinians are the primary target because we happen to be there. But actually, this is a project that was meant to paralyze the Ummah. So it's the cause of the Ummah. There are so many other problems the Ummah has. I mean, from China to India to Syria to Africa to various places. Yes, we have so many wounds. We have a wound in Yemen, we have a wound in Iraq, we have a wound in Syria, we have a wound in Libya. We have a wound in India, we have a wound in China. Now, the difference here is that this is the one issue that involves a global Western colonial project whose primary purpose is to hinder the progress of the Ummah or even the revival of the Ummah. So, kill all the Palestinians. So what? You have more than 1 billion Muslims. What is the population of the Muslims nowadays? 1.7 I hear, I think, or probably 2 billion already. For every one of them, Palestine is a primary cause. Also because in Palestine there is Al-Masjid Al-Aqsa. And Al-Masjid Al-Aqsa, I mean, you know, all of you, what it means. I don't need to tell you. The first Qibla, the third to be visited of all the mosques. Not only that, it's the venue to which Rasulullah ﷺ was taken on a night journey from Mecca in order to make a flight to the upper heavens. And Allah could have done this for him from Mecca. But why bring him all the way to Al-Quds? Because Allah wants us to pay attention to this partnership, to this twinning between Mecca and Bayt al-Maqdis. These are the pillars, the 3 pillars of our culture, of our tradition, of our shrines, of everything that is holy to us, Mecca, Medina, and Bayt al-Maqdis. It's a long story. Probably I've been able to tell you just a little bit of it. I hope that if you have questions or points you'd like me to clarify further, we can add to what has been said. Thank you very much for your attention. Well, I begin with my own book. I wrote a book in the UK edition. It is titled Hamas Unwritten Chapters. In the first chapter, I tell the story of Palestine. In the second chapter, I tell the story of the birth of Hamas, its origins. The third chapter, I tell the development of Hamas ideology. The fourth, its military tactics, etc., and so on. So my book is called Hamas Unwritten Chapters in the British edition. In the American edition, it's called Hamas, A History from Within. A book I love so much and I usually recommend is called The Bible and Colonialism. It is by Michael Pryor. Pryor, P-R-I-O-R. In his book, he talks about how the Bible throughout history has been used to justify genocide and oppression. He begins with the story of what happened to the Americas. Then he goes to the story of South Africa. And then he ends up with the story of Palestine and Zionism. A brilliant book. I did mention the book by John Rose, The Myths of Zionism, and the book by Avi Shlaim, 3 Worlds, Memoirs of an Arab Jew. And by the way, you can visit the YouTube or the Al-Hiwar TV page on YouTube. I did interview Avi Shlaim about his recent book, and I did interview him before. There are some very good interviews actually with a number of Jewish intellectuals, including Avi Shlaim, including Miko Peled. Miko Peled wrote a brilliant book I also recommend it. It's called The General's Son. He tells his story and the story of his father. His father is one of the founding members of Israel. And he served in the Israeli army, and during his service in the Israeli army, he discovered the evils of Zionism. He became a staunch Palestinian activist and now lives in America, and he is the most outspoken critic of Zionism today. It's a brilliant book. It's called The General's Son. I would recommend other books also. Avi Shlaim wrote several other books. They are all of great value. The books by Ilan Pape, Ilan, I-L-A-N, Pape, P-A-P-P-E. Ilan Pape and Avi Shlaim are known as the new historians. They are the ones who proved through the study of Israeli archive that in 1948 genocide was perpetrated. If you want to read more about the history of Palestine, there is a good book by Henry Cottan, C-O-T-T-A-N. It's called The Question of Palestine. There is another excellent book, but I don't know if it is in print. You might find it on the net as PDF. I haven't looked myself. It's by Professor Abdul Wahab al-Misiri, rahimahullah. It's called Palestine, the Land of Promise. And for the Arabic readers, the books by Abdul Wahab al-Misiri are brilliant. He authored an encyclopedia of 8 volumes in Arabic called Al-Yahud wal-Yahudiyya wal-Suhiyuniyya, Jews, Judaism, and Zionism. Brilliant. And he wrote several other books. If you need further information and more literature, there are 2 centers that are specialized in the Palestinian issue. One in Beirut called Al-Zaytuna, and you can look them up. They have a homepage and you can download or order their publications. They have publications both in Arabic and in English about various issues that are related to Palestine. And there is also a center in Amman, in Jordan, called the Middle East Studies Center. So this quite a lot to begin with. Well, Muslims who justify the theft of Palestine and recognize the right of Israel to exist there, they are Zionists, because that's the idea. The idea of Zionism is to justify the taking away of the land of Palestine from its people to set up a state exclusively for the Jews. Now you have several Arab countries have peace treaties with Israel. Egypt started in 1977, followed by the PLO in 1993, followed by Jordan in 1994, recently followed by the Abrahamic agreements during the Trump administration, Bahrain and the UAE, who were immediately joined afterwards by Morocco and Sudan. To me, anybody who believes Israel has the right to exist in my mother's house, on my father's land, is a Zionist. Even if he prays, even if he fasts, I don't care, that's between him and Allah. To me, these are Zionists. They condone aggression. They condone rape, the rape of an entire nation. Those who are denying our sisters and brothers and their children medicines in Gaza today. What are they? Are they Muslim? They cannot be Muslim. They are Zionists. I condemn Israel. I condemn Israel. If you are asked this question, if you are ever asked this question, especially by the media, ask them, see, do you ask the person, do you condemn Hamas? They will say yes. Say, why? Did they kill your mother? Did they attack you? Did they take your money? Did they do anything to you? Why? Tell me, why? Because your government said that? Okay, don't you disagree with the government on some silly things? Why do you agree with the government on something like this? Why, when the government says, we want to send weapons to Israel, you clap hands and say, oh, our government knows best. But when the government raises the taxes, you say, no, we don't approve putting up the taxes. Don't you have a brain? Think. Why do you condemn Hamas? Tell me. Why? When they used to invite me on TV in Britain, sometimes they ask me this question. I immediately say, I condemn those who occupied my homeland, who caused this havoc, who caused this bloodshed. I condemn Israel and those who support it. Hamas is a national liberation movement. Hamas never carried a single operation outside Palestine. Never, ever. Another thing you can say to them. Have you heard of Nelson Mandela? Do you know that once Margaret Thatcher and Ronald Reagan said Nelson Mandela was a terrorist? The ANC was a terrorist. And Margaret Thatcher even went a step ahead, saying Nelson Mandela would never be allowed to set foot on this land. And then he came to the land, and he was given a hero's welcome. And I once said in a rally in Trafalgar Square in the heart of London, I mentioned this story to them, to the crowd, and I said, and at the time Sheikh Ahmed Yassin, rahimahullah, was still alive, and I said, who knows, maybe the day will come when Sheikh Ahmed Yassin will be here with us in Trafalgar Square. You call them terrorists today, tomorrow they will be heroes. So I don't care if you designate them as terrorists, I don't care. I was designated a terrorist. An MP in parliament by the name of Louise Ellman, a Zionist, asked the Prime Minister to kick me out of the country because I was a terrorist. I was called by The Guardian. I was in Spain at the time, and The Guardian said, oh, do you know what happened in parliament today, Dr. Tamimi? I said, no, I don't know. Oh, Louise Ellman said so and so and so. What do you say to this? I said, I challenge her to come out of parliament and repeat the same thing. Because you see, inside parliament, they can say anything. They can be as silly as they want inside parliament. But if they come out, you can take them to court. Why are you accusing me of terrorism? What have I done to you? I am a victim. I'm a child of victims. My grandparents were victims. My parents were victims. My people are victims. I should be treated as a victim, not as a terrorist. And don't be afraid. Just know your rights. That's why it's important, you young people, unlike the people of my generation, we are a bit more cowardly sometimes. Know your rights. If it is not illegal, say it. If it is not illegal, do it. But don't violate the law. Violating the law, breaching the law, going against the law doesn't serve our cause. Not because the law is sacred. Some aspects of the law are not. They are man-made, and men make mistakes. And that's why they change the law sometimes, don't they? But because violating the law does not help our cause, we have to avoid it. But know your rights so that you don't become a coward and lower your ceiling and narrow your margins. Maybe your margins can be widened with no problem whatsoever, like our silly Home Secretary, this racist woman, who said she wanted the police to ban the raising of the Palestinian flag. She is stupid because in the law it's not haram, it's not illegal. And the police officers turned to her and said, oh, no, ma'am, we cannot do this because by law they can raise the Palestinian flag. They can even say from the river to the sea. It's not illegal. So we need to know our rights so as not to be frightened in defending the cause. It's dead. The two-state solution is a Zionist idea. The idea was, in theory, to have a silly, stupid, failing Palestinian state next to a powerful, resourceful state called Israel, which is today the situation in Ramallah. They have a Palestinian Authority whose main job is to protect Jewish settlers and Israeli troops, not to protect the Palestinians. And why two states? Why? Did we have a state in Palestine ever before, by the way? I mean, we didn't have a state in Palestine. There was never something called the state of Palestine. I don't want to see a state in Palestine. I want to see the Ummah back, and Palestine is part of it. Egypt, Jordan, Syria, Lebanon, Palestine, North Africa, Morocco, half of Africa, half of Asia are all part of the Ummah. And this is what we want to revive. Not a stupid failing state like the 22 failing states of the Arab world. Look, Egypt, huge country, 100 million people, and they cannot provide medicine to their brothers who are being killed next door. What's the point of this state? No sovereignty, no dignity, no independence. To hell with the state. We want the Ummah back, an Ummah in which our hearts are with our brothers and sisters. Their bodies and our bodies are one body. We feel their pain. We respond to their cries. We rush to their aid. That's the Ummah. That's the concept of Ummah. Christian Zionism is the ideology that believes Jews must be sent to Palestine to pave the way for the coming of the Messiah. And that's why you see examples of such billionaires in America who are Christian, but who consider Israel to be their cause, because they believe they are paving the way for the coming of the Messiah. And it's a very old idea. As I said, it started with Martin Luther and Calvin, but it picked up in the middle of the 19th century with the rise to power of an elite in the UK that revived this ideology. And the turn of the century, up to the beginning of the Second World War, most of the rulers in Britain were actually Christian Zionists. One interesting thing that probably I should mention to you, you know, when Balfour made his declaration in 1917, he submitted the declaration to the cabinet for approval. All the members of the cabinet approved it except her for one. Any of you know anything about this person who refused to accept the Balfour Declaration? He was the only Jewish member of the cabinet. The only Jewish member of the cabinet. He said to them, this is anti-Semitic. Why do you want to uproot us from here in Britain and send us to Palestine? He considered this to be anti-Jewish. This is what dominated the Jewish community at the time, whereas the Christian, especially the Protestant societies, were entertaining this idea of Christian Zionism. Well, look at you. I mean, every one of us knows what sort of talents he or she has, what sort of capabilities. First of all, we can all make dua constantly in our salat. Remember your brothers and sisters in Palestine, make dua. Dua works in miraculous ways that we don't understand how, but Allah told us. وَإِذَا سَأَلَكَ عِبَادِي عَنِّي فَإِنِّي قَرِيبٌ أُجِيبُ دَعْوَةَ الدَّاعِ إِذَا دَعَانِ. Just call Allah. Allah, then leave it to Allah. But then, having made the dua, what else can we do? Generally speaking, we can contribute to bringing about awareness in public opinion. This is very important. This is crucial. I mean, I can see you. We're all young men and women. You must be probably university or graduates, recent graduates, something like this. So you know how to speak well. You know how to write well, probably. Some of you probably are better than others. And therefore, you can interact. You can react to what you read or hear or watch. Don't just say, oh, they don't like us, they are this and this, and there's nothing we can do. No, we can. If you watch a program on television and you find that it is biased or unfair or tells lies, call them, call the producer. Write a letter to the producer. If you read something in the newspaper, in a magazine, don't just let it go without interacting, without responding. You can do it individually, you can do it as groups. Recently, I was giving a talk in Petersburg, in England, and a young lady who works for the BBC came to talk to me about the difficulties they're facing. But she said to me there is one thing that is positive happening. Until recently, most complaints to the BBC about the Middle East came from Zionists, from pro-Israel audiences. She said now it's 50-50. 50% from the supporters of Palestine, 50% from the supporters of Israel. And by the way, the supporters of Palestine are much bigger than the supporters of Israel. We need it to be 90% to 10%, not 50-50. So we need to increase, and it works. Don't say it doesn't work. It will work. Another thing, if you are eligible to participate in the voting process, take this seriously and study together tactical voting. Contact candidates, whether at the council level or at the parliamentary level or whatever level, depending on the system you have. Ask them, what do they think of what's happening in Palestine? Where do they stand on the issue? Use your vote. They love to have your vote. Some of them would run after you for the vote. Use it. Yes, you get to use it every 4 or 5 years once, but use it. It can make a difference. Muslims, especially the older generation, were usually indifferent to the political process. You shouldn't be indifferent. It's important because it produces the decision makers. To do all of this, you need to educate yourself. Start, if you know enough, alhamdulillah. If you think you don't know enough, you need to start reading. Start reading. If you don't have time to read, watch programs, watch things, and there are lots of things that can be educating. We at Al-Hiwar TV, most of our programs are in Arabic, but we have some programs that are in English with Arabic subtitles, and they are highly educational, especially about Palestine, about the relationship between Muslims and the Jews, and all of this is available on YouTube. And there are many others who are also doing similar work that can be sources of information for you. The Israelis get mad when they hear people are boycotting them. So make them mad, make them madder. Yes, boycott is very important, but it also has to be done in a clever way. I don't like these very long lists of companies that seem to spare no one. That's not practical and not tactical. We need to work with the experts to target companies whose boycott makes a difference and is easy for the people to do. Because if you enlarge the list and it becomes indiscriminate, and sometimes it's not based on any study, just people adding names. I don't know why they are adding all these brands. It becomes very difficult for the ordinary people. You want this to be productive, you need to be selective, and you need to be tactical in doing it. That's a long story, but very briefly. Hamas was born on the 9th of December 1987. A day earlier, the Intifada started in Palestine. Okay, what was it born out of? It was born out of the Muslim Brotherhood, Al-Ikhwan Al-Muslimun. The Al-Ikhwan Al-Muslimun of Palestine continued to work in da'wah until the 8th of exclusively in da'wah, education, tarbiyah, all these things, until the 8th of December 1987. When the Intifada started, and the Intifada was an expression of a sense of desperation by the people under occupation. The leadership of the movement met and decided that it was about time to enter into resistance. So they founded Harakat al-Muqawama al-Islamiyya. So Hamas is the acronym, although Hamas as a word has a meaning in Arabic, which means zeal or enthusiasm, but actually it's the acronym of the Arabic name, Harakat Muqawama Islamiyya. Initially, Hamas joined the resistance, which is called passive resistance, peaceful resistance, demonstrations, rallies, strikes, probably throwing stones. But because the Israelis were responding to all of this with brutality, some members of the movement started using knives, attacking soldiers who were coming after them. Some of them managed to snatch rifles and guns and started using them. So the tactics started developing. In 1994, something drastic happened. On the 15th of Ramadan, which was the 25th of February 1994, a Jewish immigrant from New York by the name of Baruch Goldstein entered into Al-Haram Al-Ibrahimi, the Ibrahimi mosque in my hometown in Al-Khalil, and massacred the worshippers as they were in Fajr prayer. And as such, the Palestinian people felt helpless. Nobody was protecting them even when they were praying. And Hamas started resorting to what they called the martyrdom operations. In the West, they called them suicide operations, which later on they abandoned, replacing them with the rockets when they developed the technology of the rockets. But an interesting story here is that the Israelis found these martyrdom operations so crazy for them. They sent several officers to meet Sheikh Ahmad Yassin in his prison cell. He was in prison at the time. And they said to him, "Ya Sheikh, how can we stop this?" He said, "Very easy. Stop killing us, we'll stop killing you." "How can we do it?" He said, let's have a hudna. This is where the concept of hudna comes from. And I have one whole chapter in my book about the concept of hudna, historic as well as contemporary, and the story of Hamas and the offer of hudna and how the hudna will look like. So Hamas actually initially was a da'wah movement, but then added to its da'wah activities at a certain stage resistance, and its resistance grew to become a military apparatus, which they called Izz-ad-Din al-Qassam, after the name of a Syrian sheikh, Sheikh Izz-ad-Din al-Qassam, who came from Syria to Palestine to fight the British colonialists and was assassinated by the British in 1935. So this is very briefly. Yes, there were some incidents, but those incidents happened as a result of the British opening the doors for immigration from Europe to Palestine and using their authority in Palestine to give preferences to Jews, giving them land, enabling them to establish institutions. So the Palestinians felt that there was some sort of an alliance between the British mandate, which was supposed to take care of Palestine until Palestine was able to take care of itself. That's on the surface of it, but not the reality. They discovered that the British and these Zionist immigrants were actually working together. And I regret to say that some innocent Jews were killed as a result, the Jews of Hebron, who were not Zionists. But it was the British who caused the tensions to escalate between the communities, and such incidents happened. Now, Al-Mufti, see, to most Arabs at the time, during the Second World War, the Germans were not the enemy, because the Germans were fighting the enemy. The British and the French were the enemy because they were colonizing the Arab world. So if you look at it from the Arab point of view, the Germans were not a problem for us. Yes, they were the problem for the Jews in Europe. But if there was a war between Britain and Germany, and you are a victim of Britain, who would you side with? This is what happened. First of all, in terms of sources of information about the current situation, Hamas has a media office and they have spokespersons. They speak Arabic, they speak English sometimes. So they release these information. So you can always check what they are saying to authenticate what you hear. Now, regarding the 7th of October, the Israeli story that was marketed to the Westerners was mostly lies. They claimed that Hamas went in, killed civilians and beheaded babies, and it's nonsense. What happened is that they took hostages. The Hamas fighters, the official Hamas fighters, were interested in combatants. They're not allowed to attack civilians. But what happened is that Hamas itself was shocked to see that there was a total collapse on the Israeli side. No defense whatsoever. And when the fence came down, many people from Gaza rushed through. And they were the ones who were taking civilians hostages and took them to their homes. Probably you saw the old lady who was in a car driven by young men. These are just ordinary people. They took the car and they took the women with them. And that's why Hamas, when Hamas was contacted by certain countries to ask about foreign captives, because there are foreign captives, laborers who used to work in these settlements, and they were taken. Hamas said to them, ask the Israelis to stop the bombardment, because many of the captives, we did not take them. People took them. And they are in the houses of people, and we want to count them. We want to identify them. And if you know who is missing, give us the names in order to look for them. So you see, the Israelis who prided themselves with this fence that goes 25 meters in the ground, 25 meters up, and all these digits and monitoring equipment, everything collapsed. And the battalion that was in charge of protecting the settlements adjacent to Gaza surrendered or ran away. So what can Hamas do? The whole of Gaza came in. Because these areas, these towns, actually are the towns from which the people of Gaza were thrown out 75 years ago. And they kept hearing from their parents about them, from their grandparents about them. So not only that, I would recommend that you look for the clips that some Jewish ladies gave initially before Netanyahu took control, and how they described how Hamas treated them. Even taking a banana from the kitchen, they asked for permission. They played with the children. They did not harm anybody. Because these young men these are Quranic young men. They memorize the Quran. They study the Sharia. They know the fiqh. They know it's not permissible for them to attack non-combatants, civilians, women, children, priests, etc. They know all of this. But of course the Israelis wanted to again show themselves to be the victims in this, started shouting, oh, they did this, they did that. And then their supporters in the West took that at face value and started propagating it. Yeah. And one other point. Most of the casualties suffered by Israel in the areas that Hamas stormed into was done by the Israelis. The Israelis came to these houses and they found that there were Hamas members inside these houses and they were families. They wanted to kill the Hamas fighters no matter what. So they used their tanks and cannons and bombed the houses. And look at there's an American researcher who produced a whole list of evidences to prove that all these killings were at the hands of the Israelis themselves, not Hamas. The best way to really understand this is to separate between the two issues. If you combine them together, it's very confusing. Because I am one of the people who criticized Iran strongly and Hezbollah for what they did in Syria. But at the same time, I cannot deny that both Iran and Hezbollah have been helping the resistance in terms of weaponry technology, in terms of training, even in terms of funding from Iran. I regret to say that Iran is the only country in the region today that supports the resistance in Palestine, because the rest of the Arab world is as bad as I described earlier. I know that it's difficult for people who still hurt because of what Iran and Hezbollah did in Syria. It's difficult for them to make that distinction. But in the world of politics, this is the reality, that you can have a certain position on one issue that is contradicted by another position on another issue. I try to explain this to some people, but it's difficult. I can see that it is difficult. But it is a fact that it is Iranian support and Hezbollah support that was instrumental in the development of the techniques the resistance is using. I think the most important project is to try and enlighten the public, as I mentioned earlier, about the reality of the conflict, because there's so much information lacking in this regard. And the media is so biased that it doesn't inform the public. And today we have the tools. I mean, the social media has broken the monopoly, and it, to a certain acceptable degree, it gives you the space to do this. Also by personal contact. But we need also to be involved in politics, in the political process of the country in which we live and of which we are citizens. If we don't do this, no matter how big our numbers become, we will still be marginalized. Because it's the system, it's how the system works. The system here works by the people electing their representatives making decisions on their behalf. The only way you can influence this process is by being active in it. Maybe it's not that useful to establish a party that is exclusively Muslim, but it's probably more productive to see which candidates deserve to be supported on the basis of where they stand on the issues that matter to us. And I think we can do a lot, especially now that there's so much interest on the part of people. I mean, you look at the social media, you hear people saying things they were unthinkable until a month ago. I mean, today I saw an American saying, Gaza is liberating America. Imagine. Because he thought until the 7th of October, America was under colonialism from one-sided source of information. But now Gaza is telling the other side of the story, and this is going to liberate the American people from the influence of the Zionist lobby. the Western media is biased, and all they're trying to do is blemish the image of Hamas in general. Now, the reality is that in every resistance movement, there are people who are in charge of the political aspects of the work, and there are those who are in charge of the military aspects of the work. That's a division of labor. But that doesn't mean they are two completely different movements. There are two different departments within the same movement, and there is coordination and there is agreement on the general policy. Of course, the people who are on the outside, and especially those who are in Doha today, many of them are in Doha because they don't find anywhere else to go. They would love to go back to Gaza or to the West Bank if they are able, but they don't allow them. Of course, these people didn't know the details of the operation of the 7th of October because that's the work of the military department. But there is agreement between them that the political will make every effort in the political side to help the cause, to serve the cause, while the military would go on planning operations in order to liberate the prisoners. The whole idea of this operation on the 7th of October was to bring hostages and exchange them for the prisoners. There are about 6,000 men and women and children who are in Israeli jails. And they are not releasing them. They are not allowing their families to visit them. So the idea was, okay, you're not allowing them out. We are going to take some of you and we will do an exchange. Now, the principle is agreed upon between the two sides, that we do anything to secure the release of our brothers and sisters. But how, the details, etc., of course, is left to the people who are who are working on in the field. I'm not suggesting here you don't, you no longer listen or watch or read the Western media. Of course, we have to, but we need to do that with a pinch of salt. We need to do that with a critical mind, with a critical eye. And if we know that they are not telling the truth and we know the facts, we need to go back to them and explain it to them. They are human beings. They can be affected, and things can change. I was contacted last week by two ladies from the BBC who I felt from the way they were talking to me that they were just feeling guilty that the BBC was not doing justice to the cause. And they came up with an initiative that was approved by the BBC, and they wanted assistance. They wanted young men and women and children from Gaza, from within Gaza, to appear on the BBC via online to talk about what they see around them, to bring to the audience an aspect of the humanity and of the catastrophe that is happening there. So these people who are working in the media are human beings. People who are in politics are human beings. We can try to influence them. Don't say it doesn't work. It's difficult, but it can work, inshallah. I don't think there was a real war in 1967. In 1967, I was 13 years old. I think 12 years old. I was 12 years old, 1967. And I remember my mother, she was preparing a dough for bread, to make bread. And we had the radio on Sawt al-Arab, which is one of the main radios in Egypt. And they were talking about bringing down Israeli planes, successes here and there. We did this, we are liberating, and my mother was so happy. She was so, and then a few hours later, we heard that we lost our hometown. We lost the West Bank. We lost Sinai. We lost the Golan Heights. Actually, there was no war. No war at all. It was all utter failure. There was some war in 1973, but I don't expect a war between the Arab states and Israel. I expect something else. I expect to see another eruption similar to the one we saw in 2011, where the Arab masses will say they've had enough with this indignation, with this humiliation, and take to the streets and rise against these corrupt governments. I don't expect anything good to come out of these governments, but I expect the people to do something. Remember, I don't know if you remember, you were probably all young at the time, well, it was 12 years ago, 13 years ago, when the Arab Spring started, the demonstrators on the streets of Tunis, Egypt, Syria, Libya, Yemen, Iraq, they were saying, الشعب يريد إسقاط النظام. الشعب يريد تحرير فلسطين. The people want to bring down the regime. The people want to liberate Palestine. These two go hand in hand. And now Palestine is again inspiring the people to rise. And this is what I hope to see.